Hello, welcome back. I hope you're all doing well. I know it's been a while since I posted, apologies for that, but a number of awful things happened, one right after the other, so I just needed to take that time out to work through it, and now I'm back. But thank you very much for staying subscribed during that time, I really appreciate it, and let's get into today's case. This case covers one of the UK's most infamous murders of the 1990s. It's a sharp reminder that not everyone should be taken at face value. Some people can put on a very good show and we believe them, but sometimes these people become too confident and the mask slips, and just for a split second we see the tiniest glimpse of who they really are. And often that's all it takes, because after that their facade begins to fall, their story unravels, and the details of who they really are finally exposed. This is the case of the tragic and brutal murder of Lee Harvey. We start today's video in 1994 with Lee Raymond Dean Harvey, who is 23 years old. Lee, born on the 20th of September 1971, is a handsome, fun-loving young man who grew up with his mother, father and sister in the West Midlands. As a boy, Lee was mischievous and bright, always wanting to help others, and as he grew up that never really changed. Lee was interested in karate, snooker and golf, and he worked as a bus driver for West Midlands Travel. Lee loved his job and had always wanted to be a bus driver. Lee proved this when at 4 years old he sneaked onto a bus alone and travelled 2 rounds of the number 4 bus route before he was discovered and taken back to his mother. His reason for his travels was that he intended to be a bus driver when he grew up. Lee took good care of his appearance. He always made sure that his hair was immaculate and his favourite clothes were always the ones that had designer labels on them. He was a ladies' man, but he was also a family man. He was very close with his parents Maureen and Ray and his sister Michelle. He also had a daughter named Danielle who he shared custody of after splitting up with her mother. Lee was a good father. He doted on his daughter. So it's 1994 and Lee is a single guy. He loves to go out with his friends. He works hard and he plays hard. And one evening he goes out into town for a night out, and there he lays eyes on a pretty young blonde. As soon as their eyes meet, there is an immediate and magnetic attraction. The two start chatting and they hit it off to the point where the couple spend the entire night together. Lee is immediately smitten with this young lady, and this young lady's name is Tracie Andrews. Tracie Marguerite Andrews was born on the 9th of April 1969 and grew up in the West Midlands to her parents John and Irene, who married in 1963. Tracie had 2 siblings, one older and one younger, and John and Irene stayed together until Tracie was 8 years old, at which point they separated after having a very volatile relationship. Tracie left Bridleymoor High School in 1986, and as she matured she started taking an interest in her appearance. She wore a lot of makeup and had long blonde hair. She received a lot of attention from men, which she enjoyed, and she hoped someday to become a glamour model. She collated a portfolio of photographs of herself in case any opportunities came up. But those plans had to be put on hold for a while when in 1991 Tracie, at 22 years old, fell pregnant to her boyfriend of 4 years, Andy. She gave birth to a daughter named Carla. However, she and Andy split 10 months after Carla was born, but for the sake of Carla they remained on good terms and agreed to share joint custody. So by 1994, Tracie is a single mother and she is selling hair and beauty products on a market stall, and later goes on to work as a barmaid in Alvechurch in the West Midlands. Given that Tracie loved to go out clubbing in the same place as Lee did, it was only a matter of time before they would cross paths, and on this night in May 1994 they do, and they are instantly attracted to each other. This makes sense because Lee described his perfect woman as Pamela Anderson, and Tracie loves living up to that blonde bombshell persona, and their relationship moves very quickly, with Lee moving into Tracie's house just 4 months after they met. Things begin well. Both Lee and Tracie have a daughter, and so they bond over that, and so do the 2 girls, who now refer to themselves as sisters. The 4 of them coming together seems like the beginning of a new happy family. Lee introduces Tracie to his family almost immediately, so things become very serious very quickly. Sometimes the problem with moving so quickly and becoming so serious so quickly is that you don't truly know the other person that well, and it wasn't long before the cracks started to show between Lee and Tracie, suggesting that maybe this couple weren't as meant to be as they thought they were. Arguments begin fairly early on and they mostly centre around jealousy. Lee doesn't like Tracie's ex Andy, Carla's father, still being in the picture, and Tracie's no different. She doesn't like Lee speaking to his ex Anita, who is the mother of his child. Both exes are the children's respective parents, so they're always going to be in each other's lives. There's not a lot that either one of them can do about that. But instead of just accepting it, they let it continually damage their relationship, which is very quickly becoming toxic. It's very clear that this couple just don't trust each other, and as the arguments get worse, the fallout gets worse, with Tracie collecting Lee's belongings together, putting them into bin bags and throwing them out of the window. Lee then comes to collect his belongings and moves back into his mother Maureen's house. But later Lee finds a reason to go to speak to Tracie and they talk it out and get back together and he moves back in. And then it starts again. Tracie throws him out, he moves back into Maureen's house, they talk it out and he moves back in again. The problem is that although Lee knows they shouldn't be together, he also can't stand the idea of Tracie finding someone else, and it gets to the point that Lee is almost willing to tolerate the fights and the toxicity of this relationship just to be with Tracie. In October 1995, after just under 6 months of being in a relationship and in a bid to bond them closer together, Lee decides to propose to Tracie. He believes that Tracie is the love of his life and hopes that an engagement makes them more stable, that the jealousy might subside if they share this commitment. He tells his parents, who are dubious to say the least, as they are the ones always picking up the pieces when he turns up yet again asking to move in. But there's not a lot they can do. He's a grown adult and he makes his own decisions. So Lee proposes to Tracie and she's over the moon and accepts straight away, so they are officially engaged. After the engagement, the couple are excited to let their wider families know the good news, and they are due to attend a family barbecue held at Lee's mother Maureen's house, so that's the perfect time to do it. The barbecue is underway, but before Tracie can announce her and Lee's engagement, Lee's sister Michelle comes forward and asks for everyone's attention, and she makes the announcement that she and her partner are engaged to be married. Of course, everyone's over the moon. Everyone except for Tracie, whose demeanour changes in an instant from friendly and excited to furious. Her thunder has well and truly been stolen by Michelle. Tracie immediately walks back into the house and begins ranting to Lee, and she is shouting at the top of her voice, not caring who hears. Tracie is absolutely convinced that this was planned between Michelle and Maureen. She says Michelle has purposely got in first to make her announcement and steal the limelight away from Tracie. Tracie doesn't hold back, calling Lee's sister a cow, and that she knew if she made her announcement first, no one would care when Tracie and Lee made theirs. Tracie's paranoia and jealousy is taking centre stage here, and all Lee can do is to try to convince Tracie that it wasn't planned, but she's having none of it. Tracie instructs Lee that he is not to attend the wedding when his sister Michelle gets married, and Lee kept to his demand. When Michelle got married, Lee told her that he just couldn't go, and he missed his sister's wedding for Tracie. Some time passes and things kick off again between the couple, and as per their routine by this point, Lee leaves the house and turns up at his mother Maureen's house, adamant that it's over and there's no going back. And it seems as though he means it this time. A few days pass and he's still at Maureen's. That is until he receives a phone call from Tracie. It turns out Tracie is pregnant with Lee's child, and this is enough to make Lee agree to try again with Tracie. They're going to have a child together, and that's enough for him to try to make it work between the two of them. But 2 months later, Tracie tells Lee that she suffered a miscarriage after falling down the stairs whilst out shopping. And of course, this is devastating news, and the two pull together to support each other. But peacetime doesn't last long between the two, and the fighting starts again, and it is brutal. On numerous occasions, the police are called by Tracie to get Lee out of the house, and multiple domestic disturbances are logged by the police. Things go on as usual between the two until the 30th of November 1996. Tracie is taking the two girls, Carla and Danielle, out for the day, and when Lee offers to drop Danielle back at her mother Anita's, of course this causes another argument, with Tracie accusing Lee of orchestrating this drop-off just so he can see Anita, so they have a massive argument, and in the end Tracie herself takes Danielle back to Anita's house. Then later on in the evening, in an attempt to patch things up after the fight that morning, the couple decide to go to the Malbrook pub in Bromsgrove, and things are tense. They are still smarting from the argument, so they have their drinks and they leave the pub at 9:45 p.m, driving home in Lee's very distinctive white Escort XR 3i Turbo. But the journey home ends in tragedy. At 10:45 p.m, a couple inside their home, a cottage named Keeper's Cottage, look out of the window and see a car. They also see a woman and a man on the floor. They run out to find out what's going on, and they see Lee and Tracie. Tracie is holding Lee in her arms, and Lee is laid on the floor covered in blood as a result of multiple stab wounds, and Tracie is sat holding Lee and screaming. The couple immediately call emergency services, who arrive on the scene, and Lee and Tracie are taken to the Alexandra Hospital in Redditch. Whilst Tracie is taken for treatment, it's too late for Lee, as he has already passed away at the scene, aged just 25 years old. Lee received 42 stab wounds to his chest, back and neck, his cause of death being a stab wound inflicted directly to his carotid artery. Lee also has cuts on the inside of his hands, where it's clear that he was trying to defend himself from this attack. In the hospital, Tracie receives treatment for shock and for a small amount of stitches to her face just above her eye. At around 1 a.m, the police turn up and take Tracie to Redditch police station. She's constantly asking where Lee is, and they have to tell her that he has passed away. And of course she's devastated to have that confirmation that he's really gone. It's at this point that Tracie tells the police what happened. She tells them that as they're driving from the Malbrook pub, a dark coloured Ford Sierra comes up behind them. They're trying to cause trouble, honking the horn and flashing their lights and tailgating Lee's car. Lee becomes agitated and slows down, then speeds up, snaking the car along the country road, and the car behind does the same thing. This continues until they turn at the junction towards Cooper's Hill. Tracie says that it's at this point that Lee has had enough, and he stops the car, and the car behind stops too. Tracie keeps telling Lee not to get out and just to drive on, but he gets out of the car, and so does the driver of the dark Sierra, who is a young man aged around 18 to 19 with short dark hair. Tracie is still shouting for Lee to get back into the car, but Lee and this young man start trading insults, after which the young man starts walking back to the car, but then the passenger of the car gets out, a man described by Tracie as an older looking man who is wearing a donkey jacket and is, in her words, fat with staring eyes. This second man then starts attacking Lee, which is when Tracie decides to get out of the car to try to protect Lee, shouting for the man to stop. But as she does so, the older man punches Tracie in the face and pushes her to the ground. Tracie then sees Lee fall to the ground himself, and as she runs over to him, she realises that Lee has been stabbed. Then the driver of the Sierra shouts for the older man to get back into the car, which he does, and the two men speed away. Now, Tracie is the only witness to this attack, so her information is crucial and all the police have to go on, and so the investigation into the murder of Lee Harvey commences. At 3:20 a.m. on the 1st of December, the police arrive at Lee's parents' house, Maureen and Ray. Police tell Maureen and Ray that Lee has been involved in a road rage stabbing and has passed away, which of course leaves them in shock and devastation. They were incredibly close to Lee. They immediately ask how Tracie is, and the police tell them that she has some bruising but is otherwise fine. What's difficult for Maureen and Ray to understand is Lee wasn't a violent person. He always avoided confrontation. So him getting out of the car to confront two strangers was totally out of character for him. The next day, Maureen is able to see Tracie and she's very quiet. Maureen feels sorry for her. She looks terrible. Tracie usually never allows anyone to see her without her full makeup and hair done and dressed to the nines. But now she looks exhausted, having not eaten or slept. On December 3rd, the police decide that they need to get a clearer picture of what happened that night, and so they ask Tracie to accompany them to the scene of the crime to retrace what happened, and Maureen and Ray decide to attend also. As they're approaching Cooper's Hill, where the incident took place, Maureen and Ray realise just how narrow and winding these roads are. Tracie has said that Lee was speeding at 70 miles an hour that night, but these roads are so narrow and winding that would be really difficult to do, not to mention the fact that it was night time with very little light. Tracie at first refuses to get out of the police vehicle, but she does in the end, and she is shaking as she does so. She answers some questions and then gets straight back into the car without looking at any of Lee's family. Even though there are questions in Maureen's mind about some of what Tracie says happened that night, Tracie looks terrible. Her face is swollen and cut, and Maureen looks at her and thinks she's a victim as well in this, and I've got to support her to help everyone get some answers and to bring Lee's killers to justice. Police decide to hold a press conference in an attempt to appeal to the public to come forward if they witnessed anything or if they had any information. And they ask Tracie to speak at the press conference. She agrees, and Maureen offers to attend to support Tracie to help her get through it. The day of the press conference arrives and Tracie and Maureen walk into the room to the deafening sound of cameras. This case has caught the media's attention. A young, handsome couple involved in a road rage attack with only the girlfriend surviving. It was fodder for the press, so of course they were all in attendance. Maureen holds Tracie's hand for support and the press conference commences, with Tracie relaying all of the details about what happened that night, them being at the pub, leaving at 9:45 and so on. From the perspective of the press, they see this woman walk in. They're used to only seeing pictures of her looking glamorous and done up, but now here she is, bruised with black eyes and stitches on her face. She looks like she's been through a really horrific attack. Tracie talks them through what happened, saying that the two cars were playing cat and mouse, speeding up and slowing down. She was telling Lee to stop, saying it's not worth it, at which point she says that a lot of men and women behind the wheel can change under the influence of road rage, and this is what happened that night, that Lee got mad with these men behind him who were following him and taunting him, and he stopped the car and got out. Tracie says how she eventually got out of the car herself and tried to stop the attack, but the older man hit her, and she couldn't remember whether she'd been knocked out by that or not. As the press conference goes on, Tracie grows in confidence, and as she answers the questions she's asked, she's met with sympathy. She speaks about how this attack has ruined many lives, including her own. Then, in an unexpected move, Tracie turns and looks directly to the cameras and appeals to the driver of the car that night, saying, "You aren't in any trouble, this wasn't you. Just hand your friend over, you won't get into trouble." The police are taken aback by this. They never asked her to make an appeal to the driver, and they certainly didn't ever say he wasn't in trouble, because he was. He was an accessory to murder and he's driven away. He's definitely in trouble. So they were totally thrown by this. You can't just make that kind of promise in a press conference. It's a huge statement to make. And then she describes the killer, quote, "a fat man wearing a donkey jacket who has staring eyes." And when she describes his eyes, she sort of imitates him, and right at that moment the cameras flash and they capture what is probably the most famous image from this case. Then the journalists start to ask more questions, in particular about the timings that Tracie had given to the police about that evening. One journalist asks what time they left the Marlborough pub, and she says about 9:45. Then he says, but the 999 call was made at 10:45, and it's only a 10-minute journey to Cooper's Hill from the pub. At this point, the confidence starts to fade in Tracie, and she looks over at the police officer sitting next to her, who quickly shuts down that line of questioning, saying that they need more time to clarify those finer details. The thing about press conferences is that it's packed with journalists, and they are some of the most perceptive people out there, and those journalists saw something in Tracie that day. They almost unanimously agreed afterwards that something wasn't right. They just weren't sure what. The next day the papers were covered with photos of the couple detailing how this young man had been brutally killed in a road rage attack. And then something terrible and unexpected happens. On the 4th of December, Tracie is rushed to hospital. She'd been at her mother's house and taken a huge overdose in an attempt to take her own life. She's written letters to her daughter Carla and her mother Irene, explaining that she does not wish to continue with life without Lee. A police officer who happened to go around to the house found Tracie and called an ambulance immediately. Tracie's stomach is pumped and the doctors save her life, quite literally, as it was a huge dose that she'd taken. She would never have survived if the officer hadn't have found her when he did. When Maureen goes to visit Tracie in hospital, she grabs Maureen's hand and says, "I'm sorry, Maureen, I'm sorry for what I've done," which really confused Maureen. What was she sorry for? Maureen tries to give Tracie some photos of Lee to place by her bedside, but Tracie won't accept them, and she asks that they be taken away. A few days pass, and on the 7th of December, whilst Tracie is still in recovery in hospital, police get a breakthrough in the case. They found 2 witnesses. A couple out on the evening in question had driven right past Lee and Tracie that night. But they said that there was no car following Lee and Tracie. Lee's car was the only car on the road. And the reason they know this is because Lee's car is so distinctive, and they remembered it because they drove right past it. They were also able to tell police that on that night Lee was not paying attention and drove straight past the junction, forcing him to reverse the car so that he could make the turn towards Cooper's Hill. Lee was so involved in a heated discussion with Tracie that he wasn't paying attention to the road, but what the couple could confirm was that he certainly wasn't being chased. This was huge. Tracie's story was obliterated, and once that happened, things started to unravel very quickly. And then police found another witness. A little girl who lived nearby told police that she'd heard what happened that night. She said that she'd heard a couple shouting, and in that couple was one man and one woman. She said that she didn't hear any other men shouting, and she didn't hear any other sounds at all, such as a high-speed chase or a car screeching to a halt. More pieces of the jigsaw start to fit together, and police are beginning to get a much clearer picture of what may have happened that night, and it certainly doesn't match with what Tracie's told them. It's at this point police decide to act on the information that they have, and on December 7th, 1996, while still in hospital, police arrest Tracie on suspicion of murder. Once given the all clear and discharged from hospital, Tracie is taken straight to the police station for questioning. Of course, Tracie strongly denies having anything to do with this murder and pleads her innocence vehemently, repeating the story that she's always given. But on the 19th of December at 10 p.m, Tracie Andrews is charged with the murder of Lee Harvey. The day after being charged, Tracie applies for bail and is denied. But then, in a strange turn of events, the day before Christmas Eve, Oxford Crown Court decide that Tracie should be granted bail in order to go home and spend Christmas with her daughter. An alleged murderer and suicide risk is allowed to go home to enjoy Christmas, whilst Lee's family spend their Christmas in mourning without him. Of course, the media by this time are obsessed with this case, and on Tracie's release she is bombarded with press outside her home for the entire duration of her bail. In preparation for trial, Tracie launches a highly publicised aggressive defence campaign, and she and her lawyer even hold their own press conference, which is just not the done thing. It's very rare that people accused of murder court the press in such a confident manner. And the police actually attend this press conference to find out what gets said. The reasoning behind this press conference is that Tracie and her solicitor want to find the real killer, still professing that Tracie is completely innocent and is willing to do anything to find the real perpetrator of this heinous crime. Whilst awaiting trial, Tracie goes on holiday to Bournemouth and has a great time, and it's not long before Tracie is in the paper again, after a married man who spent the night with her whilst in Bournemouth tells the press all about it. So whilst awaiting trial for murder, Tracie is making sure she's enjoying every minute of freedom, whilst Lee's parents have spent their entire life savings on Lee's funeral, so they can't afford to do anything. Not that they'd feel up to it anyway. It's July 1997 and the trial begins at Birmingham Crown Court, and Tracie arrives posing and smiling for the journalists outside. Once inside, Tracie pleads not guilty to Lee's murder. The trial begins with a description of the couple's volatile on-off relationship, and how on the morning of Lee's murder the neighbours had heard them arguing, and that this was nothing new. The prosecution then begin to tell their story of what they believe happened on the night that Lee was killed. They tell the jury how witnesses recall that the couple seemed very tense in the pub that night, and how they were arguing intensely once they'd set off home, as witnessed by the couple in the car that passed them. They then put to the jury that not long into the journey home, the car is stopped, and both Lee and Tracie get out, at which point Tracie Andrews viciously attacks Lee with an imitation Swiss Army knife. Now you may be wondering how they know it was a Swiss Army knife, as there was no murder weapon found. Well, whilst at the hospital immediately after the attack, the nurses on shift said that Tracie kept disappearing for periods of time to the toilet, way more times than usual. This wasn't anything too strange on its own, but once all of the evidence was gathered, that behaviour would take on much more relevance. Police took all of Tracie's clothes after the attack, including the boots she was wearing. They were black ankle boots. And after examination, police made a discovery. What they found was a 2.5 inch by 1 inch bloodstain inside the boot, but it was a very specific bloodstain. The bloodstain was the exact shape, dimension and size of a replica Swiss Army knife, and the blood itself was found to be a mixture of Lee and Tracie's. The last time Tracie was wearing those boots was at the hospital when she was making multiple trips to the bathroom, and the prosecution argued that it was during those multiple bathroom trips that Tracie took the knife from her boot and flushed it down the toilet. The suggestion of a Swiss Army knife being the murder weapon was further bolstered by the fact that after searching the area of the attack, police found a tiny spring and some small tweezers, which are both parts of this type of knife that could have easily fallen off during such a frenzied attack. But where did the knife come from? Well, the prosecution said that an imitation Swiss Army knife belonged to Lee. He had brought 3 knives home from a holiday to Spain and gave 2 away as gifts, and he kept the 3rd one in his car. The clothing that Tracie was wearing that night also gave further clues away. Tracie claimed that she'd witnessed the stabbing of Lee Harvey and rushed towards him once he was already on the ground. The problem with that is Tracie was completely soaked in Lee's blood down one side of her upper body and her hair. The stab wound that killed Lee was the wound to his carotid artery. The carotid artery is very close to the surface, unlike other wounds where you may bleed internally. This artery, when punctured, bleeds outwards. This arterial blood will spray very heavily and rapidly over anything it's close to, and that results in a lot of blood. And there was a lot of blood on Tracie. And an expert witness in blood spatter confirmed that the amount of blood on Tracie's jumper could only have got there if Tracie was very close to Lee when he was wounded. Certainly not if she only approached him once he was injured and on the floor. And the way in which the blood had transferred onto the clothing was via a splash rather than it seeping onto her when she was holding him on the floor. The next piece of evidence the prosecution put forward was something found on Lee's body, something in his hand, which was upwards of 100 strands of Tracie's hair with the roots attached. Now, if Tracie only approached him once he was on the ground, why would he have a handful of her hair in his hand, pulled out from the root? Now, I don't know about you, but that to me is the action of a man trying desperately to pull his attacker away from him using the only thing he can grab at easily, which is her long blonde hair. The prosecution also bring out various witnesses who had seen the way in which the couple interacted on nights out. They testified that they were always arguing and shouting and that fights frequently got physical. Tracie on several occasions had hit, punched and even bitten Lee. And when I say bitten, I don't mean just a soft bite, I mean actually puncturing his skin with her teeth. Usually Lee would just take the blows or leave to remove himself from the situation. And it seems that Tracie had a real history of behaviour like this. Now, to step away from the trial for a moment, let me tell you a little bit more about Tracie. Tracie was a complicated character. She never really recovered from her parents splitting up when she was young. She was known for having a temper, especially if you remember the barbecue incident. If you upset Tracie, she would make sure you knew about it. She was very loud and aggressive when upset. The reason she and previous partners had split up was largely due to her behaviour. She was possessive and had a jealous streak. She would lose it over the most insignificant things. Due to Tracie's unpredictable behaviour, you never really knew which Tracie you were going to get, which made maintaining any sort of relationship very difficult for her. Maureen, Lee's mother, was never quite sure how to take Tracie right from the first day she met her. For someone who came across as very loud and brash and confident, she also seemed to be very insecure. She was very arrogant, and the more Lee's family saw of Tracie, the more they began to dislike her. And of course, with Lee having constant arguments with her, they knew this was not the right girl for him, especially when he would move back home covered in scratches and bruises. At the trial, Maureen found out that during one of their fights, Tracie confessed to Lee that she'd never had a miscarriage. She was pregnant, but she'd had an abortion without telling him, instead choosing to say she'd fallen down the stairs and lost the baby. And that was one of the many reasons that Lee had moved out and went back to Maureen's house, but he never told her about it. So all in all, Tracie was clearly someone who had a history of domestic violence against her partners, and this went to its absolute extreme that night with Lee. Now, back to the trial. You may remember me telling you that there were 2 witnesses at the scene who lived in a cottage nearby and ran out to help. Well, one of those witnesses happened to be a lady named Susan Duncan, who was a former detective constable, and she was the first to see Tracie that night. Now, this was pure coincidence that a detective happened to live at that cottage. Susan saw how Tracie was acting, how she was positioned, how Lee was positioned. She saw the crime scene layout, and she tells the jury that based on what she saw that night, she had an immediate feeling that Tracie committed the crime herself. She says Tracie only started screaming for help when she saw Susan had spotted her outside. She also says how she neither saw nor heard another car in the area at the time. Tracie also told Susan that night that she didn't know what the car or the drivers looked like, but by the time Tracie had left the crime scene, she was telling police that the car was a black Sierra and had a full description of both men, which seemed awfully strange to Susan, the former detective. Imagine murdering someone in cold blood and the first person on the scene by pure chance is a former detective, an expert in crime scenes and the actions of criminals shortly after they've committed a murder. Unlucky Tracie. The time between Lee dying and Susan coming from the cottage to help was 7 minutes, which seems like a short space of time, but if you think about it, in 7 minutes Tracie could have screamed for help, which she did not. In that time she could have even run to the cottage herself to get help, but she didn't. It was only when the couple left the cottage that Tracie did anything at all. It's only at that point she starts screaming. The stab wounds to Lee, as I mentioned previously, were on his neck, chest and back. The wounds to his back were very telling because it meant that when Tracie stabbed Lee, he had his back to her. He was walking away from her, the one thing she could never let him do since the day they met. Now it's time for Tracie to take the stand, and she begins to give her usual description of what happened, until Lee's mother Maureen mutters under her breath that Tracie is lying, at which point Tracie screams, "Get her out of here," pointing at Maureen furiously, and for the first time the jury see Tracie really lose her temper. Later, Tracie continues to explain what happened that night, and it is, of course, the same story that she's always stuck to, so no surprise there. That is until the prosecution start questioning her. They take her story and rip it apart, piece by piece. Every detail she gives, they disprove it, and they continue to tear her story to shreds until Tracie is almost completely silent. She's reduced to answering questions with "I can't remember" or "I don't know." For someone who was so sure of her story in the beginning, Tracie now has nothing to say because her entire story is in tatters. So on that note, the trial concludes and the jury is sent away to deliberate. After just 5 hours, they return with a unanimous guilty verdict, and on Tuesday the 29th of July 1997, Tracie Marguerite Andrews was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum sentence of 14 years. Tracie didn't have much of a reaction at all, and she is taken away. On the 6th of October 1998, Tracie appeals her sentence, claiming that she was the victim of a miscarriage of justice because of damaging publicity surrounding her case, but her appeal is rejected. So the trial is over and Tracie is behind bars, but even so, Tracie is still in the public eye. More stories come out in the press about Tracie, detailing how she was jealous and possessive with partners, frequently flying off the handle and being incredibly aggressive. One man even told how 6 months before Lee's death, she stabbed him with a car key when he told her he wasn't interested in seeing her anymore. Her story even made it into the UK Top 40 when the hit song Road Rage, written by the group Catatonia, is released, a song directly influenced by Tracie and what she did. And then, over 2 years later, in April 1999, something arrives which Lee's family never expected to see. Tracie has written a letter confessing that she killed Lee. Now, this sounds like a good thing, some closure for the family perhaps, but this letter has a sting in the tail. She confesses to killing Lee, but goes on to claim that it was done in self-defence. She said on the night of the murder they were arguing all day, winding each other up about their exes, and by the time they got in the car that night to go home from the pub, things got very heated. She got out of the car and Lee told her to get back in, which she refused to do. So she said he got out of the car and threatened her with a knife, after which a struggle ensued, and Tracie grabbed the knife and stabbed Lee in self-defence. Part of the letter read, "I saw the knife on the floor. I picked it up and when he went for me again, I just reacted with the knife. All I can remember is seeing red. I just went mad." She admitted to flushing the knife down the toilet at the hospital and that she made the story up about the two men that night. The letter basically blamed Lee for her actions, but it also said that she regretted very much what happened, which is just the kind of thing authorities might view favourably, isn't it, when it comes time for her parole hearing. It's worth noting that someone killing in self-defence doesn't need to stab someone over 40 times. If you think about it, any energetic movement that you do 40 times over, you need some resilience to do that. You'll get out of breath, you'll get tired. You could stop, but you don't. You keep going. 42 times. Lee's family said the letter was just a ploy to reduce her sentence and did not believe for a second that the self-defence story was true. Tracie had an eventful time behind bars, firstly apparently by befriending Maxine Carr, who, if you don't know, was the girlfriend of Ian Huntley, the Soham murderer who killed 2 little girls. Maxine was jailed because she lied for Huntley and gave him an alibi, so that was the kind of company Tracie was choosing to keep. Tracie then goes on to save a life. Another inmate is given CPR by Tracie after attempting to take her own life. Tracie received a thank you letter for her efforts, but I will say that she did not receive an official commendation as the papers reported at that time. Tracie was said to be a model prisoner whilst inside and was even allowed day release to go shopping. Tracie applied for a new identity and anonymity upon release, the same kind afforded to Maxine Carr after she was released, but Tracie was refused it. Instead, she was allowed to change her appearance, meaning that she received plastic surgery in 2009, which altered her bottom jaw, which prior to the surgery protruded over her top jaw, and this surgery was paid for by the NHS, costing £5,000 worth of taxpayers' money. Tracie served her full recommended term of 14 years and was released in July 2011, so she's been out for quite some time now. Upon release, she changed her name to Jenna Stevens, and to accompany her newly altered face and name, she also dyed her very well publicised blonde hair black. Tracie, or Jenna, regularly features in the papers to this day. A new story comes out every few years. She has reconnected with her daughter Carla and even got married in 2017 to a nightclub doorman named Phil, the papers running with the headline, "The Bravest Groom in Britain." And for her hen night, she dressed up as a police officer. Now, it's up to you what you think about Tracie. Some people think she served her time, she should be able to get on with her life. Others think she should be behind bars and life means life. Let me know what you think. Lee's family went through hell throughout this case and for years after, especially with Tracie always being all over the front pages for her various antics. Danielle, Lee's daughter, who grew up without a father, is now all grown up herself and has children of her own. I took most of my information for this case directly from Lee's mother, Maureen's book. It's a very personal, raw, first-hand description of what happened. And if you're interested, I'll put the name of the book in the description below. And that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give me a like and subscribe. My Twitter handle is down below if you want to follow me over on there. Have a great day, stay safe, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.